What's going on, everybody? My name is Grayson Singleton, and this is the In Focus podcast. Thank you so much for listening on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you might be finding our show today. Coming up on our show, we are going to talk about how the shooting of 20-year-old Daunte Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, has impacted the sports world. Plus, we'll also have audio from the Brooklyn Nets, a statement from the Minnesota Twins, and a discussion on a key ideal in America that you might find interesting. So stick along for that. So let's begin with this. So 20-year-old Daunte Wright, of course, we all know by now, was killed in Brooklyn Center at a routine traffic stop by a Minnesota police officer. This officer was attempting to arrest Daunte Wright after it was found that he had an outstanding warrant after being pulled over. In the wake of the shooting, several professional sports teams, including the Minnesota Wild of the NHL, the Minnesota Twins of Major League Baseball, and the Minnesota Timberwolves of the National Basketball Association, all postponed games, but eventually would resume those games and play them, albeit without fans in the stands, which I would expect for the foreseeable future. And let's just talk about Minnesota and sports for an instance. By the way, I think it will be a while till we see fans back at games in Minnesota, is particularly with NBA and Major League Baseball. NHL, those games don't really sell out much anyway, but they're doing this out of security concerns, which is what we heard first as when the news was first reported. And I'll take it a step further in Minnesota, particularly with the ongoing trial of George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin, still going on. The entire state of Minnesota is a security concern. So limiting crowd gatherings, enforcing curfews, and things of that nature are probably wise. And I would expect the Timberwolves and the Twins to play without fans, maybe for the rest of the Timberwolves season particularly, or at least until this trial of Derek Chauvin is about a month past and tensions possibly die down, assuming we don't have another incident like this. But this story hit hard in the NBA, particularly as we're coming off of a year and off of a summer where the league was at the forefront of the fight for social justice, particularly after the shooting or after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And NBA players, obviously a league that is predominantly made up of African Americans, take this to heart because these are obviously people that look like them. These are people who grew up in an era that wasn't so friendly to people that look like them, or more on a more personal level, look like me. Says Kevin Durant.
At this point, it is you just really don't understand what's going on around here. You know, it's different stories every single day about families' lives getting altered because of police brutality. And I mean, at this point, I really don't know what to say.
And he's right. At this point, we are without words. And his head coach, Steve Nash, would go on to say, a parent of two, how he cannot fathom or how he cannot understand, I'm paraphrasing here, how it is to be an African American or to be an African American parent in today's society. And I will take it a step further and make this more personal, that it's a weird time and it's a hard time to transition from childhood to being an African American adult in 2021. Because I'm 19 years old. And if you want to compare this to Daunte Wright, I will be 20 in October. That's the same age Daunte Wright was when he was killed. So there's obviously a direct parallel there, but what makes this an even more dicey situation, and I haven't said this over any airwaves ever. I've never really said this publicly. I don't even know if I've said this out loud before. But on top of it being a rather strenuous time to become an African American adult in the United States of America, compounded on top of that is the environment I find myself in. And before I go on, I want to distinguish this episode from a lot of other episodes that I've done. And the difference here is that normally you'll see I have papers here with quotes, or papers here with just my preparation or my notes or anything, or even outlines in general, just, to keep me on track. I don't have any of that today. I just have, what I use to play the audio of Kevin Durant. And the reason why is because this episode particularly, and part of my growth as a media personality, is you want to be as genuine as possible. And sometimes I feel like, even though notes and preparation is an essential part of performing this job, and hopefully performing this job as I continue to go on and on and on in life, sometimes I believe it strips the genuine emotion of things like this, which is why why in this episode I'm making so many parallels to my own personal life and where I am in terms of my development. So I don't really have much of an outline. I do have an outline because I do tend to ramble on and on without it, but today I'm going without, all the notes that I have. I do it outside of, making sure I have my information correct, because that would be doing my job a disservice. But I digress. What makes it even more difficult to become an African American adult right now is partly where I am. And this wouldn't be as hard if I was in a state or even just a region of the country that is notably more receptive to these sorts of things. If you're just tuning in or you're just finding out about the show, I do this from Stillwater, Oklahoma, which, if you don't know the geography of Oklahoma, it's in the middle of nowhere. Largely a conservative state. Not to get super, super political, but just, to set some context and some cultural background of where I am. And I go to Oklahoma State University. And the reason I say that is because I am in an environment where a lot of people are not receptive and are not empathetic to these sorts of issues. Now, there's some that are, and I've been privileged to meet people that are, but there's a lot that don't and that aren't. And when you compound already that it's hard being African American, then it's hard becoming an African American adult in 2021. I feel like 2020 was just an interesting year to graduate from high school with all the chaos that was going on. I remember being told at my high school graduation that, this is y'all's world. And we graduated in July because our graduation ceremony had to be pushed back because the COVID pandemic was still pretty fresh at that point in time. And I remember being told that this is you guys' world. And I immediately look out and I'm like, dear God, what kind of world are we living in? And now it's to the case where you've seen more instances of this. You've seen what happened with Jacob Blake last year. You've seen what happened at the U.S. Capitol. You've seen now what's going on in Minnesota, that the whole state and that whole part of Minneapolis is a huge danger zone because of the tensions that are going on and that continue to arise between the African American community and the Minneapolis Police Department. Like, we're to the point where the police chief has resigned. And there's still a segment of the population that, however sad this might be, because it is incredibly sad and incredibly sickening, is still out there looking for excuses and acceptances to justify what is going on. And that's the sad part about all this. Because while it's sad that somebody is dead, the one sliver of hope that you could ever have is that people will look at this and say there is something wrong and that something needs to change. And while there is a segment of the American population that does, there is a large segment and a large population here where I am that will find every single justification for why this A isn't a big deal, B isn't a crime, or C just isn't a continuation of a big problem and that people should just suck it up. And I'm not making that up either. And I'm not engaging in hyperbole by saying that either. And that'll lead into a point that I'll get to in a few minutes to wrap up the show. But bringing this all back to sports is that also another something I haven't said out loud that I'm going to say now. I believe athletes, more so than anybody else in our American society, have all the bargaining chips right now. And here's why. Major League Baseball, the sport that seems to be the slowest to put itself out there in terms of social change, either Major League Baseball or the NFL, has given players the green light and given players the support they need to go after tackling social issues. The Minnesota Twins said that they want to provide a platform for their players. New York Yankees manager Aaron Boone said in response to his starting center fielder Aaron Hicks, a Minnesota native, pulling himself, or a former member of the Minnesota Twins, I misspoke, in response to him pulling himself out of the lineup in the wake of the shooting of Daunte Wright, said that he understands how hard this is. So the fact that Major League Baseball has ushered in its support is saying a lot, because here's where athletes are in this sort of, in this American society, is that sports seems to hold American society together. And we saw what happens when sports is taken away from us. We saw that with COVID. And if you want to make people care, I think athletes are the ones to do it. And the reason why is because it's not other African Americans that need to hear these messages. It's part of the white population. And when you go to NBA games or NFL games or Major League Baseball games, and even though these sports are largely played by African Americans, excluding Major League Baseball, which is becoming more and more diverse, who do you see that is patronizing it the most? It will be white individuals. And players have realized that as long as they play, people will pay attention to what they have to say. And if they don't, they are more than happy to cause another societal disruption. We saw that they're willing to do it when the Milwaukee Bucks and the Orlando Magic boycotted their game in the bubble back in August. So NBA players have showed that they are willing to do this. Now, this will be harder to get done in the NFL because in the NFL, you have leadership and ownership that isn't receptive to societal change, save a few of the owners. But in the NBA and in Major League Baseball, these are two sports that are a little bit more friendly to this. And I want to transition back to the certain segment of the population that isn't so receptive to these issues. And I want to ask a question. The majority of those people, and please don't tune out, and please hear me out here, because I'm not calling people out, I'm not attacking people. I just use that to transition to this main point that I really wanted to get at here in all of this. And this thought came over me last night as I was mentally preparing for the show. The segment of the population that isn't so receptive to these sorts of issues that are plaguing the African American community, and in this case we're talking about police brutality, and before I get to that, that's what I forgot to get into. Let's take this on a case by case basis here. Number one, this is not exactly the same thing as what happened with George Floyd. That was just a complete act of, I believe, hatred and racism. Whereas this particular instance, the injustice toward African Americans could possibly come in the judicial side of this, in whether or not this police officer was or is going to be charged with a crime. That's where the injustice could possibly come in. But as it pertains to the incident that resulted in Daunte Wright losing his life, maybe about racism, maybe not. This is just about negligence and stupidity. Because if you can't tell the difference between a lethal handgun and a taser, not only is something wrong with you, or something wrong, but you shouldn't be on the police force. And, you do a little bit more digging into the story. This is a woman who has been on the police force for 26 years. So this excuse that a lot of people are using, by the way, and I'm not making this up, people have literally said, well, this was just an accident. Somebody's dead. There are some accidents you are not allowed to make. And this is somebody who is training other police officers as well. So while there's race and America's history of mistreatment of people who look like myself, there's that element to the story. There's a whole nother element to the story as well. Because if you look up pictures of a handgun and a taser, aside from the fact that one looks like it weighs significantly more, they look and feel completely different. If you can't tell that your finger is on the trigger of a handgun versus that one of a taser, you probably should not be carrying either of them, much less be in a position of authority where it is required to carry either of them. Like, that just seems like common logic here. And speaking of logic, let me ask that segment of the population that may not be as empathetic to this. Let me ask you this question, because the majority of that segment is also pro-life, an ideal that I share as well. This was something, and I talked to role models that my parents have put in my life since childhood. I talked to them a lot. And one of them, I was having a conversation with a few weeks ago, and he shared an interesting thought with me. He said, when you see a lot of people who try to excuse away or turn a blind eye to people dying in the streets, or to take it a step further, who maybe didn't care to wear a mask because your negligence might pass the coronavirus to somebody more susceptible to it, and they could die. Because that's also largely the segment of the population that you would see refuse to wear masks. So, is that considered pro-life? because that's not pro-life. And what this role model told me is that if you turn a blind eye to people dying in the streets or not do everything you can to prevent somebody from dying by contracting COVID, then maybe you're not exactly pro-life. Maybe you're just pro-birth. Can we think of it that way? Because the term pro-life has been condensed into this one sensitive topic of the morality and the legality of abortion. But there's more life that goes on past conception. Because Daunte Wright's life was unwarrantedly taken on Monday or on Sunday. So being pro-life shouldn't stop when a person is born. Being pro-life should mean that you carry that same attitude that every life matters and every life is just as expensive, no matter the gender or race, all the way until that person dies. That person dies a legal death for purposes of our topic today. Because how can you be pro-life and not want to take every precaution to make sure that the least amount of people die as possible during a pandemic? How can you be pro-life and turn a blind eye to the exponential rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans? How can you be pro-life and try to find every single loophole in the law and every single excuse to justify African Americans being slaughtered at the hands of the people that are supposed to serve and protect communities? How can you be pro-life and be okay with all of this? Because life, yes, it begins at conception, but it doesn't end when you come out of the womb. There's more life after that. And we should treat every life as expensive, as it matters, all the way until someone should be taking their final breath. To me, that's what pro-life means. Caring about life long after that person is born.